Start working through the female reproductive system. Again, as I was saying before, functions pretty similar. Production of gametes, production of the sex hormones. Again, different gamete, different sex hormones this time. Also, we're going to be at this point no longer delivering semen, obviously, but reception and then maintenance of that developing embryo and fetus. So when we talk about the gonads of the female, these are going to be the ovaries, held in place by a number of different ligaments, as you can see here. To me, this always kind of looks like a little bit like a moose head, where the uterus is the head, the nose, and here's the antlers and the ears. But when we're looking at the ovaries, it's this part right here, and you can see they're not technically attached to the rest of that. That fallopian tube kind of surrounds it like this and is going to be able to catch those oocytes when they're released. Again, held in place by a number of different ligaments here. Blood supply from branches off the abdominal aorta is going to be supplying this, making sure these get good blood flow. They have those same tunics of connective tissue that are surrounding the outside of these that we saw in the male and the testes. But the big difference on this one is we're going to be looking at different ovarian follicles. So the green arrows here are pointing at the different follicles underneath those different layers here, the cortex and the medulla. And it's going to be monthly, the development of these follicles that is going to lead to ovulation and the possibility of an embryo forming. So ovarian follicles, we're going to see there is actually 4 different types of follicles. And this first show is just going to be kind of walking through what happens at the ovary through the different follicular stages and what can happen after that. So the types are the primordial, primary, secondary, and Graafian follicles. Primordial follicles, very kind of the primitive ones here, surrounded by some simple squamous cells here. These are all present at birth. Like it says, about 1.5 million and more than you could probably ever need. I don't think anybody's going to have 1.5 million kids. But there's plenty of those present at birth. Primordial follicles, again, the egg cell, which is decently large, surrounded by simple squamous cells. The primary follicles, these are going to be the oocyte surrounded by a single layer of cuboidal cells called granulosa cells. This starts happening during puberty. As these start making more layers, we're going to see these cells, these granulosa cells, make and secrete estrogen. And there's some cells in the periphery of that follicle that are going to help convert that estrogen made by the secrete androgens that the estrogen, that the granulosa cells can convert to estrogen. So you can see a primary follicle here is now, you can see cuboidal cells, either a layer or a couple layers surrounding that oocyte. This is going to happen at the beginning of each month as an egg cell is getting developed or an oocyte is getting developed for ovulation. Secondary follicles, what differentiates these ones? You get that primary oocyte with lots of layers of granulosa cells, but they have now a fluid-filled space called an antrum that is going to be starting to form here. This is going to force the oocyte to one side of the follicle, and we're going to see a group of cells called the cumulus oophorus, or the egg cloud basically here, is going to surround that egg cell. So you can see it right here. Secondary follicle, the antrum has now formed. You can see this is the cumulus oophorus surrounding it. And that corona radiata is that innermost layer of those cells surrounding it. And so you can see a couple examples of the secondary follicles here. What we're going to see is these follicles starting to get larger and larger and larger as this is completing some of those parts of meiosis. And we're going to see that we're going to get generally one follicle that is going to get to this really large fluid-filled antrum, this large vesicular follicle from that secondary follicle. And that's what gets us to this Graafian stage, which you can see here, large fluid-filled antrum. On every image, this little circle right here, the oocyte is about the same size. So you can see at the beginning, it's not much bigger than the oocyte. Here at the end, this is the entire follicle at that point. You can see it's got much larger and kind of dominates the whole structure here now. And you can see we have this oocyte on a little stalk surrounded by that cumulus oophorus. What's going to happen after that is that stage, the Graafian stage, is where ovulation can take place. And we'll talk a little bit more about the signals that lead to all that and the hormonal interplay that goes on there. After that egg cell has been ovulated, the remnants of that follicle can become what's called the corpus luteum, or yellow body. Actually, it's body yellow. This starts making much more progesterone and a little bit of estrogen still. We're going to see it does a number of things for the uterine lining and preparing for a possible pregnancy. We'll talk about all that on a lot of these other, one of the other shows here. If no pregnancy takes place, or even after a pregnancy takes place, sooner or later, this is going to completely regress that corpus luteum to what's called the corpus albicans, which is mainly just connective scar tissue, and the rest of those structures have been reabsorbed. So you can see kind of the different levels here. Primary follicles here, they don't really have the primordial here, but you can see secondary follicle with the antrum. This would be a primary follicle as well. You can see when it gets to that grafting stage, it doesn't really show it on the stalk, but ovulation takes place. We're then left with that corpus luteum, and then sooner or later becomes just scar tissue of that corpus albicans, which is not on the picture here. These are showing kind of those graphian follicles being ovulated. Gross way to kind of say it, but it's almost like a pimple popping in terms of what's happening here. The pressure builds up, and the connective tissue on the wall loses its structural integrity, and this bursts out through. We're then going to see the fallopian tubes are generating a current with their cilia that is going to draw that oocyte into the fallopian tubes and down to the uterus. And this shows that corpus luteum and the remnant of that follicle, again, making mainly progesterone and some estrogens, but a lot more progesterone in this case. And again, we'll get into the hormonal interplay and what goes on there in terms of how this actually regulates that ovarian cycle, what's going on with that, and what's going on at the uterus. So, and that's some of the stuff we'll be looking at the next time.